Two situations now developing on opposite sides of the world have a strong bearing upon the subject of this morning, and I think should cause all serious persons to pause and consider. At this time in Israel, the Inquisitor General of the Nazi program of anti-Semitism is on trial. And the reports of this trial indicate a very serious problem, not bearing directly upon this issue, which is serious enough, but upon the circumstances by means of which the human mind and the human emotions can be falsely directed to a degree dangerous to the survival of the human race. This month's issue of the Reader's Digest contains an article by Lowell Thomas on the present situation in Tibet. This situation is almost beyond human conception. And if Lowell Thomas's reports are correct, and he has secured them from persons escaping the country, this again is a blot on the name of humanity. Here a small nation, perhaps of 2 or 3 million persons, living a very quiet and secluded existence, and certainly not to be regarded as in any way dangerous to any type of political enterprise, is being subjected to atrocities that transcend description. These atrocities are aimed at one essential point, namely the destruction of the religious life of these people. It is assumed, apparently, by the communist Chinese that their control of a people depends upon the liquidation of the faith of that people, and if necessary, the entire generation of believers whose minds and souls they cannot control. The program further requires that all youth, young people, from infancy, are to be given a new conditioning, by means of which they will be taught to turn upon their own parents and kill them if necessary, in order to advance a certain political ideology. Now, these things are happening far away. They seem to be affecting small groups. We are deeply moved and sympathetic to the problems that here arise. But perhaps we do not understand or recognize the full machinery that is operating, not necessarily within a single political group, but in a social process which is of the gravest concern to all of us. Our subject this morning deals with the hidden factors behind human behavior. And it seems to me that we have here rather dramatic laboratory examples of certain processes going on in the world continuously, which can spread and are spreading and are even spreading among so-called democratic peoples to the ultimate hazard of our way of life. This situation is sufficiently real and serious for us to give it a great deal of thought. A large part of the world's problem today, unfortunately, originated with us. As we went quietly along our way, doing the things which seemed to be opportunistic at the moment, we forgot the tremendous psychological influence that America has had upon the entire civilization of mankind. We have overlooked our responsibilities as enlightened examples of a way of life. As a result of this, we have created around us groups of persons who envied what we had and were determined to acquire, in their turn, these privileges and advantages. With this envy, there was naturally a more careful consideration of our methods. And this consideration has led to a great deal of the trouble that now broods in the world. The tendency of the last generation has been the tremendous exploitation of the concept of economic progress. We have measured everything in terms of the physical status of the individual. We have sacrificed a great deal here to advance our economic development. And one of the principal things that we have sacrificed and are sacrificing is our ethics. And as our ethics go down, our ambitions and our selfishness correspondingly increase. Until today, in a small way, in a mild way, we are more or less moving into this block or pattern of peoples determined to advance physically, regardless of the cost in every other department of life. This determination, probably with us, has no single focal point. It is not the result of a definite indoctrination on the part of leadership. It is simply man's own natural selfishness gaining greater and greater control of his conduct. The individual has gradually weakened those parts of his character by which he was able to direct his efforts with a certain measure of cultural integrity. The loss of this integrity, in this nation particularly, bodes very ill for the future. It warns us definitely that consciously or unconsciously we are aligning ourselves with forces in society which we do not admire and whose actions we regard as reprehensible. So let us think for a moment of the policy which has been used in practically all of the totalitarian states of the world to accomplish what might be considered a general change in human character, to abruptly halt the ethical progress of man, and to substitute for it a kind of advancement based almost utterly upon selfish interest. Now we will assume that Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Mao might all be moved by one basic concept which they regarded or regard as humanitarian. In other words, behind all of this totalitarian motion has been the concept of raising the standard of human living to the degree that people would be able to live well, to escape from ages of poverty or oppression, to break down the bonds and boundaries by means of which these persons or these groups were held in subjugation by other groups and nations. This situation also we see unfolding before us in the present African complex. The only difficulty is this, and I believe it is a basic difficulty. If in the process of overcoming one evil, we must so indoctrinate the human mind that it loses sight of essential good, then if we are successful in raising the standards of these people to a way of life in which they are prosperous and internally and economically secure, we produce a group of people so indoctrinated that they are then a menace to themselves and each other. In order, for example, for one of these major powers that has been working along totalitarian lines to reestablish ethics and culture within their own group at some future time, they will be forced to turn upon themselves and exterminate perhaps 2 or 3 generations of their own people who have been so taught and so indoctrinated with non-cultural ideas that they cannot be changed. These totalitarian powers will then have to do exactly the same thing within themselves that they are now doing to other peoples. You cannot culture a man after you have taught him that culture is a debasing and enervating thing. You cannot preach to him ruthlessness and then suddenly expect him to become civilized. The final problem of these people will be that their policies and their ethics must ultimately undermine the very policies they are seeking to advance. This situation portends very little that is good for anyone concerned. Study of the psychology behind the problem is perhaps best expressed in the examples that we can see today in the groups under present stress patterns. To begin with, a group or a leadership, which of course has become so complete that there is practically no escape from the boundaries of its influence. This group sets in motion a kind of doctrine. It sets up a concept of what is right and what is normal. It then proceeds along several lines to enforce the new concepts which it has set in motion. One of the simplest ways always to enforce these ideas is to reach youth, to take the untrained and impressionable young person whose orientation is yet imperfect and who has to depend largely upon example and circumstances for his life pattern, and begin to indoctrinate him violently with certain concepts. These concepts aim at the elimination of a previous social condition, concepts in which the person is subjected to several kinds of pressure. One of these kinds of pressure, which affects young people very quickly and very basically, is ridicule. No young person wishes to be ridiculed. Life for the adolescent is difficult enough without the person finding himself in a completely non-social situation. If certain things which he does are ridiculed, he will ultimately stop doing them. If religion is ridiculed, and his associates ridicule him for his religious concepts, he is going to either submerge them or valiantly attempt to overcome them, especially where there is no religious force with any influence or authority to combat this indoctrination. Therefore, example, ridicule, and the indoctrination through the reconstruction of a public school system, the constant pressure of fashion, a fashion set up to make humanitarianism unfashionable, to make dictatorialism fashionable. These pressures working upon the minds of the young must certainly have a profound and lasting effect. The only way in which this effect can be eliminated is again through the passing of long time and the rise of new generations. The whole world pattern has to change and make these very crisp, non-ethical patterns no longer fashionable. Thus, through education, through example, through youth organization, through the general program of society itself, through indoctrination with basic concepts of venerated leaders, these means, one by one, applied with continual increasing severity, gradually force the young person into a new attitude toward life. He has no orientation to protect him. He has no value to compensate for the values that are being forced upon him. He is made to feel that everything that he has previously known is wrong, and therefore that he must either depart from it or suffer the ridicule and penalty of the new society. This is one way in which this is accomplished. The other, and perhaps less obvious way, is the result of certain attitudes gradually corroding or corrupting a society, until one by one the individuals making up the group are brought into line with a common attitude. This may not be dominated by any dictatorial force, but it is dominated by a subtle code of punishments and rewards. And as nearly all persons wish to be rewarded, and very few people wish to be punished, and very, very few people have will enough and strength of character enough to resist all forms of propaganda, the result is a gradual and insidious corruption of basic values. To a measure, this is the situation that threatens the West. Here we are not under any dictatorial policy that says that we have to do this or have to do that. We are, however, under a continual pressure of profit. Certain things are profitable to do. Certain things are not profitable to do. And in the last centuries, those things which are most profitable are no longer most ethical. Those procedures by means of which we hope to advance our physical estate are contrary to those codes and principles by means of which we develop mature personal lives. Thus, we have come here gradually to a series of compromises, and these compromises are abetted by general pressures of our time. It is true that our academic materialism in the West is by no means of the violent nature which we find in dominated countries. It is true, however, that young people here are subjected to ridicule, to a certain not belongingness in our educational system if they try to preserve those ideals which they have received from their parents or from their religious tradition. So subject to a minor but continuous ridicule, many millions of young people are gradually becoming materialistic, becoming essentially atheistic, as an essential to the adjustment with the new order of life as it is developing in our heavily scientific and heavily industrial society. By degrees, then, we see the inevitable encroachment of a negative situation, a situation against which we have no well-established defense. And if this encroachment continues through the rising generation of young people, we may expect this generation to take control of world politics in the next 20 or 30 years as our mature leaders. And they are going to assume this position internally inadequate. They are going to assume this condition with profit as their primary consideration, rather than the basic advancement of the society to which they belong. The gradual crumbling of ethics everywhere in the world has made possible the atrocities which astonish us and bewilder us today. This situation is associated with what might be termed a hyper-intellectualism which we have developed in the West. We are not under the same motivations as dominated states of Europe and Asia. We are not struggling to maintain a standard of living in which we can survive. We have gone past this entirely. We are now struggling for a way of life which is largely the continuing gratification of our most selfish inclinations. We have security. We have had it for a long time. There was much we could accomplish in perfecting it, to bring gradually those less secure groups into full partnership in our security. But this is no longer the prominent motive in our thinking. We are thinking not only of security, we are thinking of the inevitable, continuous, and eternal expansion of our economics. We are thinking of the time when an individual, no matter what his status in life may be, whether he is employed or unemployed, whether he is intelligent or non-intelligent, will be able to have 3 cars in his garage and at least 1 swimming pool. This is now our idea of basic necessity. We are therefore reaching a point where we are selfish, not for what we need, but merely for what we want. There is some excuse for an individual who is absolutely unable to support his family or to sustain himself with reasonable dignity for having a strong drive towards economic improvement. But at our point in the development of nations, this point is no longer the dominant one. We have become habitual accumulators. We are desperately desirous of continually advancing to a point that is unreasonable in any organized society. We cannot imagine that such a situation can be attained without the individual dedicating himself wholly and completely to an economic program. If he does so, he will find, as we are finding, that this economic program becomes ever more complex and unethical. That the profit being the one and complete end and purpose, the means for attaining this end falls into opportunism. Anything that we can use as a means to gain our end becomes legitimate merely because we want that end. If we train 25 or 30 million young people in this concept in the next 10 years, we are going to face a very serious problem 20 years in the future. We are going to find people increasingly skillful and decreasingly honest. We are going to find that the rights of the individual are meaningless, and we are liable to turn into a pack of wolves, each one preying upon the other, each one looking for weakness in the other, and then turning on the members of his own pack and devouring them. It is not good to have this kind of thinking, but how are we going to evade or avoid the inevitable inclinations of peoples and the evidence which we see around us every day? There is a very deep need in this country and in other free peoples for the development of a strong ethical cultural program. A program in which the individual places the best part of himself as the leader of the rest. Unless the individual is able to maintain the vitality of his own conscience mechanisms, unless he is able to sense what is right and hold firmly to these principles which he knows to be essential, he will gradually fall under a series of opportunistic pressures from which he will have great difficulty in recovering. That these situations should arise in far places among underprivileged groups is understandable, but that we are not able to combat the situation more intelligently on our own level and in our own more advanced civilization seems very difficult to understand. It can only mean one basic thing, namely that the civilization of man is very precarious as far as his own nature is concerned. That the individual has pressed forward on the level of advantages far beyond the degree of his own internal integration. The conflict is not only present on the level of morals, but on the level of health. The average person today is sick simply because of conflict in his own nature. He is sick because of the stress of factors pulling in opposite directions. Your totalitarian powers have attempted to ease this sickness or correct it by removing entirely the conscience pull. They have made simple obedience to the state the supreme virtue, and the end to be attained, world domination or absolute economic prosperity. No other situations have really inspired these movements. Ethics, where it has survived, has become the tool of political purpose, and the individual finds that he is told that his instincts to venerate should now be directed entirely upon the party or upon the group of leaders that are dominating his way of life. These things give us a lot of thought in psychological situations, because they are not only collective problems, but they are individual problems. In the life of the individual, we know from bitter example and proof that the kind of policy which dominates most of this materialistic totalitarianism is not effective in the life of the person. Now, some hold that it would be effective if all people acted that way. This, however, has not been demonstrated, and it is quite certain that where these groups have enforced their policies upon the peoples, the very enforcing group, the leaders, have then turned upon each other, and that for loss of ethics and for lack of ethics, even the unethical cannot survive. There has to be a kind of honor among thieves, or even thievery falls apart. And there has to be a certain sense of honor among criminals, or they betray each other. And this gradual loss of the entire basic principle of integrity now turns upon those responsible for its destruction. And we find that government in these countries is a mass of petty conspiracies, no individual safe from the very machinery he himself has created, no one able to escape the consequences of the powers placed in unscrupulous hands. Thus, every tyrant rests uneasy. He is not certain when his own tyranny will turn upon him. He cannot expect any friendship, any integrity, any affection, any regard, or any true respect from his own associates. When a situation reaches this degree, it tells us that it is sick, and any policy which brings on such a situation is basically unsound. Yet as we go merrily along our way, hoping each day that stocks will improve, or values go up, or wages increase, we lose entire sight of the tremendous undermining that is going on in our public and private relationships. Now, I certainly do not advocate or believe that it is proper that a people should have a religious ethics forced upon them, that they should be required to comply with some theological code. But it is obvious that ethics as a principle is necessary, and that unless this principle is recovered, restored to value, is honored and respected, is taught with respect to the young, and is practiced with respect by the older, if these things do not happen, what we term civilization will fall apart. This falling apart process is visible today in many parts of the world. It is also very visible in the private lives of individual citizens. So we now pass from this larger theater of, we might say, laboratory testing into the smaller, untested areas of human behavior. We know, for example, that for many years we have had a general intellectual materialism, that this materialism affects those areas in which perhaps we have our greatest dependency. It affects our education, it even affects religion, it affects our higher professions, law and medicine, it is strongly affecting psychology, and it has more or less corrupted our entire Western philosophy. It is to be found throughout our economic structure in business and business relationships, where the tendency to desperation today is causing a continual fall of ethical attitudes. It permeates and practically nauseates us on the level of entertainment. It is present in our literature and in our art. It is attacking to a measure our music, but fortunately most of our unhappy situations arise among people who have not sufficient skill in the field to make a well-notated musical scale. They simply do not have the ability to compose music. We are therefore perhaps better off on a musical level than on any other. In these different situations, the individual is growing up, or he is growing older, and in an effort to survive, the individual is attempting to adjust. Adjustment is good and necessary, but adjustment should always be upward. Adjustment should be the individual striving to be better, and his adjustment should be rewarded in terms of his improvement. In other words, the individual who lives better should experience the advantages that come from a better way of life. He should not be placed in the unfortunate situation that the better he lives, the more miserable he is, and that all advantages lie in adjusting downward to a situation which is socially and individually unsafe. In other words, it is very much like a problem of a sickness being variously treated. The theory in illness, of course, is that the cause must be removed. And if a cause is present, it is up to the physician to recommend as wisely as he can, and it is up to the patient to observe carefully the regulations that are recommended. However, the end of the problem is not merely the obscuring of the ailment. Therefore, a medical adjustment to sickness, which simply consists in doping the patient, cannot be regarded as solving anything. The adjustment must be upward. The individual who wishes to feel better must live better. If he can be taught that the worse he lives, the better he'll feel, he will certainly be a very avid disciple of that particular cult. But even though he is taught this, it does not operate in action. The consequences of compromise are always more compromises. And little by little, the individual falls into a difficulty from which he cannot extricate himself. So we have here every conceivable inducement for thought, while thought is possible, before processes reach such a complete impasse that there is no way out of the dilemma. Well, then we can begin to approach these motivations or causes behind what we do. The most basic cause, the most basic motivation known in man has always been fear. Unfortunately, fear is older than faith. Fear is deeper. And nearly every despot has played upon human fear. Every great enlightened leader has sought to build human faith. Thus, the struggle between fear and faith is the same struggle as that between tyranny and wisdom. The search in the case of the tyrant is always for the vulnerable area he can control through fear. The great man, the truly enlightened person, can only control through faith. Faith must be always an upward conviction. It is a conviction of the reality of things better than they appear to be. It is the faith also that the individual, by his own efforts, can bring into existence a more commendable existence for himself and others. All true and essential progress is built upon faith. All false progress, leading ultimately to destruction, is built upon fear. In each human being, the elements of fear and faith are in continual conflict. Fear causes the person to seek to survive, placing the survival or the status quo above every other consideration. Fear is therefore the basis of compromise. The individual striving in every way possible to protect himself against that of which he is afraid will fall into the most dismal misdeeds in the effort to put off some evil day of reckoning. Fear, then, is an ever approachable area in the human subconscious. Fear of loss, fear of ridicule, fear of isolation, fear of poverty, fear of sickness, fear of death, fear of the law. All of these fears have been used from time immemorial in the effort to control human beings. As long as man can be controlled by fear, one fool can rule another. As long as fear places all advantage on the level of force, power, or authority, the despot does not need to be particularly wise. He is not particularly wise, and in the course of time, almost always his despotism falls apart. But not until he has done a great deal of enduring and painful damage, and has left the world a heavy burden of debt to be passed on to future generations. The principal agency that we have against fear has been faith. And faith has been founded for the most part upon the religious convictions of man. The story of man's struggle to be better than himself is a story of religious effort. This does not mean that religions have always been right. This does not mean that many religions have not had within themselves a great element of fear. Some religions have used fear, and used it very unwisely, perhaps setting thereby the example which has brought back the karma of non-religious persecution. But fear in religion, even when it has been perverted, has largely been used in an effort to cause the individual to keep faith with something superior. It has taught him the importance of some kind of basic ideal. It has taught him to honor his Creator. It has taught him to keep the laws revealed through the religions and sacred books of the world. It has taught him honesty, a measure of honor and integrity, and has made him sense the importance of preserving the dignity of his own soul. These forces, regardless of their periodic corruption by pressure, these forces have basically been at the foundation of practically all human progress. Practically every leader to whom we now turn with respect in memory or in history was a person who had some kind of internal faith, some kind of conviction that there were rules and principles beyond man, and that these must be obeyed. It is such basic concept that has given us the roots of practically every culture, science, art, and philosophy that we know. This problem then comes down to the private life of the citizen. In his own nature, fear and faith are forever quarreling. Fear is unfortunately, is not, for the most part, fear of lack of ethics. It is fear of need on some physical level. Thus we may say that the most dangerous types of fear have been those by which man has been influenced to renounce his own rights as a person and to become the slave or servant of some doctrine or belief, largely for the sake of expediency. If expediency takes precedence over integrity, we will have the wrong kind of believing. It is a mistake, of course, to feel that faith itself cannot be corrupted. That is the problem that is being worked on now by most of the totalitarian powers. It is to shift man's faith from faith in principles to faith in leaders, and to faith in ideas which are themselves not sound. The individual is being taught a kind of faith which can ultimately bring him into a form of fanaticism, which is noted throughout most of the totalitarian states. But in our private life, each of us has this fear-faith problem to confront. And each person must use such means as he possesses to keep his fears from dominating him to the degree that they cause a continual compromise in his character. If he does not achieve this, he is going to slowly slide into a total loss of ethics. Many means are used in society today to disillusion people. And disillusionment, while in itself perhaps only a correction of one error by another, is at this time rather a dangerous habit to indulge. This process of eternal criticism makes us particularly subject to the kind of thinking we want to avoid. I have noticed that most people who are hypercritical have a tendency to seek an escape through the lowering of their ethical standards. Hypercriticism causes us to have a revulsion or a rebellion against organized society. When we become hypercritical of our institutions, we very likely have no really sound recommendation to make. We are just unhappy. We are just a little frustrated by things. And much of this criticism, much of this general feeling is the result of a very bad press, a constant agitation of the public mind through the newspapers, television, radio, and other instruments of so-called communication, which are gradually becoming instruments of misinformation. Criticism seems to justify the individual breaking the patterns of his own values. Criticism becomes a negative tool, therefore. And like nearly all negative instruments, it produces the unerring proof of its own fallacy. Criticism, when it becomes habitual, as it does with a great many persons, nearly always results in a lowering of the health pattern. Criticism destroys man's natural bodily functions. Criticism increases tension, leads to neurosis, and leads to sickness. An attitude which produces only a destructive result in the person who holds it cannot be regarded as a right attitude, regardless of how apparently justified it may be. I have never believed in this type of righteous criticism or righteous condemnation. The answer seems to be that behind all of these patterns, nature operates. And nature rewards those that keep its rules and punishes those that break its rules. Therefore, natural rules and natural law and order must be our final authority on most things. And nature does not reward negation. Nature does not hold out any real inducements or real promises to persons who take destructive attitudes regardless of cause. Nature does not reward the negative attitude which produces no common good. Thus we find that surrounding our central core of fear, which is our negative danger, there arises a group of classified fears. Each of these represents some form of anxiety, some effort to defend ourselves, some effort to protect something that is not essentially true or essentially right. And in our fears, we are constantly moved to justify ourselves for conduct that is not what it should be. So we create a great pattern of justifications. And these justifications finally summarize into one grand justification, namely that we are the victims of conditions. We are the victims of other people. We are the victims of the generation in which we live. We are the victims of the historical progress of mankind. We are the victims of policies we do not advocate, but which we do not have the courage to resist. These policies, however, are only catalysts, and we are reminded of the simple fact that if today there was no Russia and there was no China, there would probably be no reason to assume there'd be any more peace in the world than there is now. We would create some new catalyst. We will always have something, because this something becomes the grand excuse for our own failure to do that which is next, or that which is correctly necessary. Always we have to have the scapegoat to blame for the fact that we lack the personal courage to live well. We lack the personal incentives to live well. We are unable to gather up enough self-control to direct ourselves through even minor crises in our living. But in order that we shall always be right, even though we always are miserable, we have to create some form of excuse mechanism. So our justifications for our conduct become strongly supporting factors in the lowering of our ethical standards. We use our justifications to undermine our ethics. And we try to undermine our ethics by undermining the ethics of other people. This goes on and on and on, leading to from one compromise to another, until the whole pattern of society falls apart. Each person then, is surrounded by a series of pressures which induce him to react expediently but not wisely. He reacts according to his mood and not according to the morals of the situation. Fully acquainted with the essential principles of society, we are willing to compromise these principles because at the moment we lack the desire or the strength to live them. I think we can find this in practically every phase of human relationships. It is distinguished in the breaking up of the American home. It is present in the general neglect and failure of proper supervision of children. It is present in our offices, among our friends, in our business associations, everywhere. It simply means that the individual has the individual feeling that he is powerless against the pressure of circumstances. He has the feeling that circumstances, the world around him, will turn upon him and ridicule him, will disparage him, will impoverish him, penalize him in various ways unless he plays the game. And by playing the game means to fall into this pattern of generally lowering ethics. Not long ago, a young man I know graduated from college with good honors. He wasn't the top of his class, but he wasn't the bottom. And he started out, and before he had graduated, he was already spoken for by a large industry that wanted him. He was rather flattered. Here he was out of school only 3 or 4 months with a salary of $8,000 a year, his own car, an unlimited expense account, and 5 or 6 of these credit cards with the leading companies of the country. This was, he considered to be a fair start for a young man, of course nothing exceptional. He wouldn't stay there long unless he had rapid advancement, but at the same time, he was starting out. Well, it all seemed wonderful. Industry was more paternalistic than he had ever imagined. It was patting him on the head all the time. It was telling him how wonderful it was, and also ready to spend another $10,000 to further his education in order that he might fit better into the pattern of things. Naturally, his head was in a bit of a whirl. It got in a bit of a more whirl, however, almost immediately. He discovered, for example, that in order to succeed well in this business, it would be practically a requirement that he become a chronic alcoholic. All of this business was transacted with the aid of liquid libation. Every time the boys got together to discuss business, they proceeded to discuss most of it under the table. Whenever the big customer came along, it was necessary to wine and dine him, and it began to appear that this career could be extremely complicated on this one circumstance alone. The young man was gradually being faced with a situation. Does he want all this with alcoholism, or does he want to give up alcoholism and probably lose all the rest of it? This is his decision. Whether he shall have a short life and a merry one, what he will do with hardening of the arteries later will be no concern of the business, because the moment he can't carry his liquor like a gentleman, he won't have a job anyway. This is just part of a situation, and this young man is obviously a bit confused. It is a wonderful opportunity to go out and do bigger and better things. He likes the basic line of work. He wants to be in that line. But he hardly expected that it would cost him his life as quickly as it now appears as though it might. He's not certain he wishes to be a martyr to the project. Fortunately, at this stage in his life, he has the possibility of decision. He is not married and he has no family. If he had a family and a home and a mortgage to pay off and a few other things, the decision would be more complicated than it will be for him. But this is the situation in one level. In order to succeed, he is going to have to do things that he knows are not right. He'll be lucky if alcohol is the only compromise he has to make. It will ultimately probably be that he will have to accept the rule of the business as virtue, or else he will not be able to survive in this line. Young people growing up in this country should not be faced with such situations as this. It is totally unreasonable, undemocratic, and unnecessary. Yet behind the reasons as we now see them is this intense competition and the fact that there will always be someone, some company, some business that will function on this highly competitive level and force others to follow or else accept bankruptcy. The whole theme shows what is happening, what is gradually moving under the surface of our way of life. A way of life in which all values are being sacrificed to the constant enlargement of economic so-called prosperity. This continual process of corroding and corrupting values, and in the name of success, positing an image of success which is totally non-ethical. If we keep on with this, we cannot expect to enjoy certain other things which relate to ethics. If we train ethics out of the man, we can always hope that he will live a double standard, that he will go out into the business world and be unethical and come home and be ethical. We cannot depend upon this, however, very long. There are a few persons in whom such a compromise might possibly drift for some while. But for the majority, one general pattern is going to dominate all conduct. And the person who loses his ethics in business, loses it in his profession, loses it politically, loses it socially, is not going to practice it personally. This we have to face. And the result will be a lowering of the citizens' respect for society which demands this compromise, and the loss of such ethical values as patriotism, which may sometime be very necessary to his country. He cannot divide in this way without ruining the better value in himself. Always compromise lowers standard. And the continually compromising pattern of our time continues to emphasize merely certain values, the value of success, the value of scientific progress, the value of elevation to distinction or honor, and actually fails completely to give us any final ethical value. This ethics is, however, necessary to the steering of a nation, steering of its complicated course in a world of conflict such as we have today. We are not especially proud of the showing which our leaders are making in various fields of endeavor. We can only assume they are doing the best they can. They are also the victims of a process which for nearly 100 years has gradually been undermining the ethical convictions of young people. As these people grow older, they have not the ethical strength to make strong decisions in moment of need, nor do they have any essential inclination to sacrifice their own estates for any common good. So they do the best they can without hazarding themselves, and keep on a continual process of compromise, this process leading ultimately to destruction. In our personal living, we are therefore under the same general situation. We are losing the power to control ourselves. We are losing it because no one cares anything about it. It does not seem to make life any better for us when we do control ourselves. We are not appreciated for the expression of any integrities. And by degrees, lack of recognition, lack of utility, These pressures cause us to wonder whether the practice of these values is worth their cost. Nature says, however, that this practice is worth its cost. And nature has an interesting way of bringing the whole matter into the light. First of all, we are not as yet in a condition or in a position to fully estimate our own relationship with nature or the universe. We have certain concepts and convictions. Those who hold them feel them to be right. Those who do not hold them regard them as mere superstitions. Sometime not so long ago, someone asked a Russian who was belonging to the modern party what the Russians thought of Christianity. And he said they now include it among the comparative mythologies. In other words, it's in the same condition as the gods of Greece and Rome as far as Russia is concerned. An interesting, archaic myth that at one time had influence on public mind. Well, perhaps this is a little kindlier than the Chinese attitude toward the Tibetan Lamas. But at the same time, let us ask, what is being given instead? Assuming the possibility always that a religion can be supplanted by a greater one, let us see what is being given instead. The answer is very obvious. Total and complete allegiance to a concept originating in the mind of Karl Marx and some of his associates. Marx, therefore, becomes the new spiritual leader, becomes the new focal point for veneration, the new basis for respect, regard, devotion, integrity, fealty in all its forms. We study Karl Marx and we study the Bible. There are many things in the writings of Marx that are interesting and good, but the total picture is by no means as optimistic or as basic or as certain to produce common good as the admonitions and the simple principles set forth in the sacred books of the world. That these sacred books do contain a higher ethical concept cannot be denied. And the fact that these books have not produced the harvest we might have hoped for is not because they do not have that concept, but because up to the present time man has not been able to live that concept. Yet we cannot deny that in private life the religious teachings of the world have strengthened and sustained innumerable hundreds of millions of human beings. These individuals have lived better, have been of greater value to themselves and others because of these convictions. And while they have always been persecuted or have always been a minority group, still from this minority group has come the greatest progress that we have known. It is not possible, therefore, to merely substitute dedication to the state for dedication to principle. The state is not principle. The state is not always right. The state can itself become merely a tool in the hands of ambition, and then dedication to it or to its purposes may be little better than a statement of suicide. We cannot depend upon these attitudes for survival. Man is also under several peculiar problems. Man is the only being or creature that we know that is conscious of the possibilities of its own destiny. Most things live very much in immediacy. They live now. Their problems are now. Man, however, has a memory of the past and a hope for the future. Man has the kind of consciousness that can envision something of his own nature, something of his own substance and structure, and can contemplate upon the mystery of his own existence. And out of this complication and this contemplation, man has come to question whether or not his entitled existence is to be lived here. The problems of materialism is to convince him that he lives only once, lives only here, and when he dies, that's it. This has the tendency, according to the practical thinker, of relieving man from any sickly addiction to mystical preoccupation. It also, more importantly, relieves him of any sense or willingness to rebel against materialism. This is the primary consideration. What he believes is not particularly important to these people, other than as it affects their own ambitions in the forming of the state. So to destroy man's sense of immortality is, of course, to limit him more and more to material concerns and force upon him the immanence and vitality of his immediate conduct. Thus, materialism shortens his perspective, makes today vital, makes tomorrow comparatively meaningless. It makes the individual feel convinced that his morality and his ethics have no value beyond his present existence. Now, we don't all hold to this principle. Many persons are sincerely convinced of a survival of consciousness. Yet most persons also live as though this was the only life they would ever live. They seldom, if ever, permit the consideration of the future to in any way cause them apprehension over present action. The individual who wishes to be cruel does not seem to be deterred by the thought that this cruelty may go on to some other state to plague him. When he feels like being cruel, he is cruel, unless his internal sense of value is immediately outraged. If this person basically regards cruelty as something unworthy of him, if he honestly and sincerely believes, for some reason, or by some belief or doctrine, that cruelty is wrong, and believes it totally, then he has the power to control his own cruelty. He has the power not to practice that which violates his entire nature. If, however, his nature has been made no longer capable of censoring his conduct, then cruelty toward any end which seems to be advantageous becomes immediately justifiable. The person does not have to fight it out in himself. Actually, this great world situation has risen from small fountains that have been flowing since the dawn of time. For no situation can arise in society that does not primarily exist in man as an individual. He cannot produce that which is entirely dissimilar to himself. And the various forms of policy which we have today represent the fragmented aspects of the human psychic personality. They represent the different moods and pressures by which we are influenced. And each of these moods moves out to become a social entity, and then proceeds to lock itself with other similar entities, even in the same way as our own conflict of moods lock with those around us, or even with the phases of our own disposition. Thus, the basic problem must always lie in man's lack of internal orientation. In the daily problems that we face, there is also another problem that is becoming less and less interesting to modern man. And the loss of this interest is having its heavy toll upon our conduct. And that is man's willingness to accept responsibility. Today we are disinclined to accept anything which becomes a deterrent on freedom. The individual is moved by one of the most primitive instincts Somewhere back in the dawn of things, Cro-Magnon men undoubtedly had this instinct and perhaps controlled it no better than we do. But at the same time, we're supposed to be able to do a little better. And this is the sense of that every individual must do exactly as he pleases. Well, this wouldn't be so bad if the individual pleased to do anything worthwhile. But usually his pleasure simply consists in waste. And usually this waste is in turn a harmful procedure. So we do not have any adequate sense of responsibility interfering with self-action. Many people no longer regard marriage as any interference with the absolute freedom of personal conduct. They resent children because this threatens interference. They resent any form of regular employment, so that the average person resents his work. We resent the laws of the state. We resent the laws of our stomach. We resent anything which, even for an instant, would interfere with our sovereign right to do exactly as we please, whenever we please. Now, obviously, we also have certain limitations on this. We are, to a measure, realists. We know there are things we cannot do, even if we please to do them. But within the area of the things that we can do, we reserve at all times the right to do them, regardless of results, regardless of danger to life or to property, regardless of menace to health or to the rights of others. A good example, of course, of this is the present problem of traffic, where the general lack of our civility is obvious at all times. If it was not for police enforcement, no one could get anywhere, as the result of each individual thinking only of himself and having no interest whatever in anyone else. This total determination to do as we please, stretching out into society, is exploited as all selfishness is exploited by individuals who have realized that it is always possible to climb high if we are willing to climb on the habits of people who are wrong. Thus, by catering to the weaknesses of man, we can become second-rate heroes. We can become popular, but we will not contribute anything of lasting or permanent value. This, however, again, is of no meaning if we are basic materialists. Back to ourselves, then, knowing that we are vulnerable, knowing that instinctively we are frightened, instinctively we are selfish, and instinctively we are strong-willed, with this tremendous determination to please ourselves regardless of cost. These add up to something that is of value for us to think about. Now, some persons are still motivated by a certain sense of responsibility, but this sense of responsibility is not enriched by understanding. These persons become slaves to duty. They do things and gradually move into neurotic patterns as the result of the self-sacrifice of themselves against their own will and inclination. If we keep our duties and do not believe in responsibility, we will become neurotic. So on one hand, we have the person who loses all ethical control of his outer action, and then we have the other person who destroys the healthiness of his internal neural organization. One or the other suffers. No materialistic concept that we have been able to hear about up to the present time has really solved any of these basic dilemmas. The various 5-year plans have become 10-year plans, 20-year plans, and will be 50-year plans. And the ends will not be attained. Because as the programs spread, they create their own increasing dangers, until finally it is about all we can do to keep abreast of our own compromises. We do not solve anything. The only answer to any of these problems lies in the individual taking hold of himself. The integrated person is the only one who is safe. He is the only one who is not hastening not only his own fall, but the fall of his fellow man. And this integration does not have to be complicated. It does not have to be involved. It does not even have to be painful. It can be really quite enjoyable once you get the knack of it. But it is utterly and completely necessary. And it begins where it must always begin, in the most immediate personal problems of the individual. It begins where the world problem begins, in the family, in the home, and in the heart. And if these are right, the world problem will gradually solve itself. But while these remain basically wrong, and every individual can be successfully tempted, we will have no certain ethics upon which to build anything. Man's temptational point is too low. It is too easy to move him away from what he considers to be value. He lives practically to be tempted, and he is waiting impatiently for the opportunity to succumb. He really is more interested in succumbing to a good temptation than almost any other activity of which he is capable. The beginning of our the cause of our behavior complex, lies in these ancient roots and ancient forces that we have brought through with us. They have been constantly contributed to by the foolishness, the selfishness, the stupidity, the basic ignorance of other people. They have come to be intensified by the basic ignorance of our own parents, their inability to cope with situations. And we have come down with this vast inability situation. Because we are uncomfortable, because what we have done does not operate smoothly, because we see no particular solution, we are inclined to try these desperate experiments. We are inclined to fall into some trap from which we may be 1,000 years in extricating ourselves, as, for example, in this trap of world socialization today. It seems to be no worse than what we have, but it actually is infinitely worse, because what we have is a bad situation which we could correct. What they have is a bad situation which can no longer be corrected, and can only be solved perhaps as a result of hundreds or thousands of years of enduring misery. Western man still has the chance to make a voluntary adjustment with the facts that are necessary to him. If he doesn't take advantage of this chance, he will gradually lose it. He will gradually undermine himself until he forces a dictatorship or an autocracy upon his own way of life. Nothing can continue leaderless, and if man doesn't lead himself, he will be led by another. And if nations know a direction in which to travel, some opportunist is going to step forward and show them a direction, even if it is the wrong one. Beginning then right in the habit mechanism of our own thinking, we have one standard that we have not properly estimated. I feel that this is a simple key to so much that I reiterate it frequently. The effect of conduct upon function. Man's functions came to him out of a universal archetype. Nature created these functions to meet basic need. And man today, acting contrary to function, is violating a simple rule which he can understand, which he can examine, and with which he can work if he wishes to. We take a person, for example, who suffers from alcoholism. He has a comparatively inadequate personal life. When he was young, perhaps he attended church moderately, but he did very little with it. Later, life took hold of him. He got busy. He made the usual compromises. Perhaps he had the nice car and the equivalent of the credit cards. Perhaps he was early blinded with success and compromised his position by developing alcoholism. At 55, 60, 65 years old, this man looks back upon the terrible wreck that his own weaknesses and his own compromises brought upon him. He wishes he could escape. He would like to find some footing on which to rebuild at least what rests or remains of his life. He wishes to gather back to himself a certain measure of self-respectability. So today, perhaps he hears of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he goes there and he talks with other men who have gone through the same experience. And he learns something very important, something that he would never perhaps have brought to bear upon alcoholism, and that is the great need of the help of a divine power. Perhaps this man at 60 suddenly begins to estimate the value of prayer. Perhaps he suddenly realizes that there is a power of good in the universe that will help him if he helps himself. He finds himself surrounded by other people who have succeeded. He can hear testimony after testimony of alcoholics who, by working together, serving together, helping each other in the name of God, truth, and right, have rehabilitated each other. Here is a source of confidence. Here is an example of an ethical process that is essentially right. The man falls in line with this. He suddenly realizes that his own strength is not enough. He gains a faith in a divine strength at the root of life. And a year later, he has given up alcohol and has become perhaps himself a worker in this cause to help others to recover from this very great curse of modern living. So he has found an answer, and it works. The constructive answer has made him a better man. It has solved a problem which he could not solve in any other way. He has accepted the leadership of a divine principle, and it has led him to peace of mind and the restoration of his own sense of self-merit or self-worthiness. Nations could do the same thing, but they won't. Nations could also realize that in a divine ethics, by the supporting of principles which are true, all the problems of society could be solved. The reason this is not done is because too many of these groups do not wish a solution. What they want is a power which will enable them to exploit their fellow men. As a result, therefore, they are talking about answers, but they will not turn to a way of life that will give answers, because to do so would demand unselfishness, and this is one virtue they do not intend to develop. In this concept, however, of the alcoholic restoring himself, we find what faith, what integration, what demonstration, what evidence and testimony of others can do to restore value. The same process in reverse could destroy value. It is therefore to get energy and archetype moving constructively that is important to everyone. Perhaps we need more of these anonymous movements. Perhaps we need unselfishness anonymous. Perhaps we need kindness anonymous. Perhaps we need acceptance of responsibility anonymous. Certainly we need to recognize that in the neglected virtues of our own natures lie the solutions to most of our individual and collective problems. But unless we can bring them out in some way, unless a virtue seems immediately utilitarian, unless we can perceive its benefits and that these benefits transcend its costs. The average person just doesn't do anything about it. He waits until the damage is done, and then perhaps finds himself unable to cope with the situation. Ethics must be the answer. It is the only working solution we have to these problems. Ethics must dominate the person, or the person will become a victim of one group of conditions or a party to another. There is no way in which the basic pressures can be avoided unless the individual moves in upon his own nature and does something about it. Nearly all great bad habits of society and of individuals begin as small ones. They begin with the person breaking simple principles. Principles which, when he first breaks them, he knows he has broken them. But habit gradually dims his realization of values until at last he is unable to cope with the situation. So we would suggest very strongly that the person recognize that in the processes of today, as we find them in homes, in schools, in entertainment, in science and art, there is this desperate need for the raising of the ethical platform rather than the lowering of it. The principal cause of the lowering platform today is economic. It is the individual desiring to have more of this world's wealth. Most of our so-called prostitution of principles is for profit. Therefore, as long as this profit remains so complete and total, it forms a virtual dictatorship. And the dictatorship of profit is just as moralless, heartless, godless, and cruel as any dictatorial policy that ever flourished in the world. Now, this does not mean we all have to be poor. It does not mean that we have to go back to a 14-hour day at $7 a week. It does not mean that many of the advantages and privileges that we have cannot be preserved and, in fact, improved and enlarged. But it means that the individual whose heart and soul recognizes nothing but profit is a poor candidate for any form of permanent good in society. Now, among the forms of profit with which most people are concerned is self-satisfaction. If there isn't a dollar in it, there is at least a certain measure of triumph, a self-satisfaction which arises from doing what we please rather than the satisfaction that should arise from doing what we should. Now, in our small ways of living, such satisfactions come by giving ourselves vent to dissatisfaction in its various forms. Thus, at the beginning of our great program of world grief are the envies, jealousies, and private dissensions of people. The individual who finds it rewarding to hurt someone or to retaliate against some real or imaginary injury. The individual who believes that two wrongs make a right may ultimately have to live under a totalitarian system because he has gradually contributed to the disregard for ethics and the corruption of our moral life. Any person, therefore, who is not trying sincerely to govern his own conduct, direct his own thoughts, preserve his own ideals, is just as much of a fellow traveler as someone who is on the fringe of an un-American policy. The person who is not preserving the right of a free people, the right of that people to do what is right. Anyone who is not protecting this and serving it by doing what is right, so far as it is humanly possible for him to do so, and envisioning greater right, which someday he will be able to practice. Unless he is moving forward towards a higher sense of values, he is moving downward toward a collapse of culture. And in the process of this procedure, the individual who is moving up to the future of what is right is enjoying comparative freedom from neurosis and the phobias and frustrations which are listed in the psychological textbook. The individual who, keeping principles, is moving toward convictions, this person is healthier. His home is more secure. His happiness is more certain. And everything that makes life better is more available to him. And there comes a time when he begins to recognize that this availability of peace of heart and peace of soul, this is more important to him than the terrible crash and struggle which he terms success. Inasmuch as success is proven to be so completely and inevitably impermanent, it is scarcely worth completely sacrificing our own consciousness for. What is success to us even in the mortal span of life, if the last 10 or 15 years of our lives must be spent in hopeless pain and misery, simply because we have broken rules? What is success in life in terms of loneliness, the disrespect of our children, or the necessity of watching our children gradually corrupting into the very patterns which we ourselves have practiced? What advantage is there in these special goals that we set for ourselves if they produce for us nothing that brings immediate or subsequent peace of consciousness or understanding? We think that we can handle these situations, but in every instance the situation topples us over into chaos. So we will begin by recognizing that these secret causes lie first in certain atavistic principles to negation which are locked in us, and that man grows or becomes truly man by the victory he achieves over his own negations. That man has been equipped by nature with the power to resist fear, the power to cultivate faith, the means to discover and experience hope. Man is the only creature that does not have to obey his own lower instincts. He is the only creature capable of censoring himself. And his estate as a human being depends upon the voluntary improvement of his character through dedication to principles. This improvement is not just in big things. It is daily improvement. It is the person practicing for a larger destiny by the continuous application of the censorship of his principles over his conduct. Censorship which does not necessarily even mean just honesty, but censorship which means kindness, thoughtfulness, understanding, courtesy, appreciation of fineness, the willingness to sacrifice the lesser for the greater, and the recognition that the true, the beautiful, and the good must always be the greater. Out of a gradual strengthening of our backbone on these situations, we can build back the ethics that are in danger of being lost to us. And unless we build them back, we will not only contribute to our own downfall, but will contribute to the satisfaction of these other groups who are convinced that they are right, that Western man cannot restore his own ethics. They are depending upon this. Marx depended upon it. Karl Marx depended upon the selfishness of man to destroy so-called Western civilization. And we cannot afford to let him be right. But the only way that we can prevent the wrong people from being right is that we are right ourselves. And out of this rightness, we control the mainspring of our own action. And by moving in behind ourselves, we permit only those kinds of actions to come into manifestation which have passed the censorship of our own ethical consciousness. If we do this as persons, we'll be healthier. If we do it as nation, we will be happier. And if we are able to gradually set an example which will help to release other peoples from bondage, we will then fulfill our destiny of true world leadership. I'd like to mention at this time that this morning outside there will be the coffee klatch, and everyone who is interested is invited to attend. We have some manuscript lectures on the table this morning: Value of Prayer in Psychological Integration, Vital Concept of Personal Growth, and Incompatibility, A Crisis in Modern Living. These you can secure if you're interested. Also, we have some of the old mimeograph lectures, which occasionally come in, and we pass them on to people who are interested. Lectures that we gave in the past. Most of them are entirely undated, therefore the information is as useful now as at the time the lectures were given. I'd like to mention that next Sunday morning our subject here will be a psychoanalysis, whence, where, and whither. The problem we mentioned this morning, the basic problem, has slipped into science pretty seriously. And today the general theme or field of psychoanalysis is also at the crossroads. Which way is it going? Where are we to find the indications of the proper role to be played by this therapy in the solution of the basic problems? Are we going to find that this group of thinkers also follows the grand compromise? Or is it going to stand firmly for those values which we really desperately need? Now, I've mentioned also in the past that we hope that you will do whatever Christmas shopping you can at our book tables. If we think it will help you solve your problems, and your support will help us to solve ours. So if you can, we hope you will do some of your shopping with us at our various activities. Also remember, there is coffee this morning. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again next week.